He was 19 years old when he landed in Vietnam. He was 20 when he came home. But the person who stepped off that plane in 1968 was not the same person who had left. No one who knew him could explain exactly what had changed. His mother said his eyes were different. His father said he just needed time. His country said nothing at all. 58,220 Americans never came home from Vietnam, but the ones who did come home discovered something no one had prepared them for. You can survive a war and still lose everything. They were 19 years old, and they believed. The first thing you need to understand about Vietnam is that it did not begin with cynicism. It began with belief. In the early years, the young men who boarded the transport planes believed what they had been told, that they were going to stop the spread of communism, that they were defending freedom, that America did not lose wars, that their government would not send them somewhere without a plan to bring them home. They were 19, 20, 21 years old. Some had never left their home state. Some had never seen the ocean. Some carried photographs of girlfriends, mothers, younger brothers who looked up to them. Some carried Bibles. Some carried Lucky Charms, rabbit's feet, coins worn smooth from being rubbed between anxious fingers on long nights. They were not naive because they were stupid. They were naive because they were young, and because the adults around them had told them a story about America that made the world feel simple. The good guys wore our flag. The bad guys wore theirs. We would win because we always won. The plane descended through thick clouds, and the door opened, and the heat hit them first. Not the sight of the country, not the sound of it. The heat. A wall of wet, heavy air that smelled like nothing they had ever encountered before. Like earth and rain, and something else underneath that they could not name yet. Some of them would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe that smell. Most would eventually stop trying, because the smell was not just a smell. It was the moment the world they had been prepared for and the world they had actually arrived in separated from each other. And they would never fully close again. Saigon in those early years had a strange beauty to it. Markets open at dawn, motorcycles weaving through narrow streets, children selling cigarettes and cold drinks to soldiers who didn't speak their language. Old women in conical hats who had seen armies come and go for decades and had learned to carry on regardless. The soldiers moved through the city like tourists who had forgotten they were not tourists. But the jungle was different. The jungle was where the story really began. Because the jungle had no rules that America had written. It had no front lines, no clear enemy positions on a map, no moment when someone blew a whistle and the other side came at you in a straight line so you could see them coming. The jungle had shadows. It had silence that was worse than sound. It had the particular terror of not knowing whether the tree line 30 meters away was empty or full, of not knowing whether the villager who smiled at you that morning had planted something in the road you would walk home on that afternoon, of not knowing whether the ground beneath your feet was solid or whether it had been made into something else entirely by hands you never saw. Vietnam did not break American soldiers with a single blow. It wore them down slowly, day by day, patrol by patrol, with heat and humidity and insects and jungle rot and the weight of a pack that never got lighter. With the particular exhaustion of being afraid for so long that fear stops feeling like fear and starts feeling like the normal temperature of being alive. A soldier named Tim O'Brien, who survived Vietnam and spent years afterward trying to write it into language, said that the hardest thing about the war was not the danger, it was the uncertainty. You could prepare for danger. You could not prepare for not knowing when, not knowing where, not knowing who, not knowing if the war you were fighting made any sense at all. That uncertainty was the first thing Vietnam put inside them, and some of them would carry it for the rest of their lives. The war without a front line. There is a particular kind of fear that belongs only to Vietnam. It is not the fear of a charging enemy. It is not the fear of artillery you can hear coming. It is the fear of the invisible. The fear that everything familiar might be a weapon, a road, a bush, a child's toy left in the middle of a path, a tree that looks like every other tree except that someone is behind it. In conventional warfare, the enemy wears a uniform. You can see him coming. You can prepare. But in Vietnam, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. He was the farmer during the day and the fighter at night. He was the jungle itself, which hid everything and revealed nothing. He was the booby trap buried so carefully that the ground above it looked exactly like the ground that was safe. American soldiers developed a kind of sensory paranoia that had no name in the military manuals. A hypervigilance so constant, so total, that the nervous system simply could not sustain it. The body is not built to be at maximum alert for weeks, months, years at a time. Something breaks, not dramatically, not all at once. It breaks the way a bridge breaks when the weight it was never designed to carry has been on it too long. Slowly, then suddenly. In the villages, the confusion was of a different kind. American soldiers were fighting for the hearts and minds of a people whose language they did not speak, whose culture they did not understand, whose history with foreign armies occupying their land went back centuries before the United States existed. Some Vietnamese welcomed them. Some feared them. Some fought them. Some did all three depending on the day and who was watching. And American soldiers, 19 years old, trained to fight a conventional war, were now supposed to be able to tell the difference. In the heat, with weapons. After weeks without sleep, after watching friends die in ways that could not be processed cleanly. This is where the moral collapse of Vietnam began, not in Washington, not in the Pentagon, not in the policy papers of men in suits who had never set foot in a rice paddy. It began in the gap between what soldiers had been trained to do and what the war actually asked of them. A gap so wide that some fell into it and never found their way out. My lie happened in that gap. 504 unarmed civilians, a village, a morning, men who had been turned by months of fear and loss and confusion into something that the 19-year-old who had boarded the plane would not have recognized. This is not an excuse. It is something harder than an excuse. It is an attempt to understand how ordinary young men arrive at extraordinary horror. And the answer Vietnam gives us is uncomfortable. It says that the line between soldier and something else is not as solid as we need it to be. That war does not only kill the body, it rearranges the soul. And that when a government sends young men into an impossible situation without honesty about what they are walking into, the government bears a weight that no victory parade can lift. Meanwhile, in the air above the jungle, a different kind of war was being fought. Helicopters became the defining image of Vietnam in a way no single weapon had defined a war before. They brought supplies. They brought reinforcements, they took out the wounded, and they played music. Because some pilots believed that if they were going to fly into something terrible, they would fly into it with the volume turned up. There is something in that detail that captures Vietnam better than any statistic. The absurdity of it, the humanity of it, the desperate, furious insistence on remaining human inside something that was trying to make them into something else. The war cost money that America was borrowing from its future. It cost lives that America was taking from its youngest, and it cost something harder to measure. It cost the belief that the men making the decisions were telling the truth. The night America watched the war on television, January 31st, 1968, Tet Offensive, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. A ceasefire had been announced for the holiday. Both sides were supposed to stand down. And then, in the early hours of the morning, more than 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters launched coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including Saigon, including the grounds of the American embassy. For years, the American government had been telling the public that the war was going well, that the enemy was weakening, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. The Tet Offensive did not just challenge those claims, it destroyed them on television, in real time, in American living rooms. And this is where Vietnam became something no war in American history had been before. A war that Americans watched from their sofas. The television camera did not lie the way official reports could lie. It showed the bodies. It showed the smoke rising over the embassy. It showed the faces of soldiers who did not look like men who were winning. And it showed Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, sitting behind his anchor desk after returning from Vietnam, looking directly into the camera and saying what he believed to be true, that the war was a stalemate, that the United States was mired in a conflict it could not win on the terms it had defined for itself. When Lyndon Johnson heard what Cronkite had said, he reportedly turned to an aide and said that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. He was right. But what Johnson had actually lost was something larger than a news anchor. He had lost the assumption that the government and the people were on the same side of the truth. That assumption, once broken, does not heal quickly. In some ways, it has never fully healed. Back in the jungle, the soldiers who had survived Tet processed the news in their own way. Some felt vindicated, some felt betrayed. Some felt nothing at all because feeling nothing had become a survival mechanism. A soldier named Ron Kovich, who would later write about his experience, described coming home from one patrol to find his unit gathered around a small radio, listening to news reports about protests in American cities, about young people burning draft cards, about politicians calling the war a mistake. He said he did not know whether to feel angry or to feel that the people back home had understood something that he was still too close to see. That ambivalence, that inability to land on a clean emotion, became the psychological signature of the Vietnam veteran. Not heroism, not villainy. Just a man standing in the middle of something too complicated to hold in both hands at once. The long way home. The war did not end cleanly. Wars rarely do. But Vietnam ended in a way that made every other American ending look tidy by comparison. April the 29th, 1975, Saigon. A helicopter on the roof of the American embassy. A line of people trying to get to it. And the slow, undeniable, televised reality of the most powerful military in the world, leaving a country in a way that looked, to anyone watching, like flight. For the veterans who had already come home, that image landed differently than it did for civilians. They had given years. Some had given limbs. Some had given friends. Some had given the part of themselves that knew how to be at peace. and now they watched the thing they had been asked to fight for collapse in an afternoon. The homecoming of Vietnam veterans is one of the most painful chapters in American history, not because of what happened to them overseas, but because of what happened to them when they returned. They came back to a country that did not know what to do with them. Some were met with hostility, called baby killers by protesters who directed their anger at the war toward the people who had fought it. Some were met with silence, a silence that was almost worse. The silence of a country that had moved on. That had decided, collectively, that the easiest thing to do with Vietnam was to stop talking about it, to let it recede, to treat it like a fever that had broken and left no permanent damage. But the men who came home knew the damage was permanent. They knew it in the way they could not sleep, in the way they flinched at sounds that other people did not hear, in the way they could not explain to their families what they had seen because the language for it did not exist in peacetime. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not yet a diagnosis when most Vietnam veterans came home. The condition existed. It had always existed, but it did not have a name. And without a name, it was invisible. These men were told to move on, to put it behind them, to be grateful they had come home at all. Some managed it, or appeared to. Some did not. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans was and remains significantly higher than among veterans of other wars. The divorce rate, the rate of homelessness, the rate of addiction. These are not statistics about weakness. They are statistics about what happens when a country sends young men into an impossible situation and then refuses to acknowledge what it asked of them. When a government takes the best years of a generation and returns them broken and then looks away. The Wall. In 1982, a 21-year-old architecture student named Maya Lin designed a memorial. It was not what people expected. There were no soldiers frozen in heroic poses, no flags captured in stone, no triumphant narrative carved above the names. Just a long black wall angled into the earth bearing 58,220 names. Every name a person, every person a story that ended before it was finished. When the Vietnam Veterans Memorial opened in Washington, something unexpected happened. Veterans who had not cried in years stood in front of the wall and could not stop. They reached out and touched the names. They pressed their fingers against the letters as if touch could do what language could not. They left things at the base: photographs, letters, dog tags, a can of beer for a friend who had liked beer, a high school graduation photo for someone who had not lived to graduate. These offerings were not planned. No one organized them. They emerged from the same instinct that makes people leave flowers at the site of an accident. The need to mark the place where something irreplaceable was lost. The Wall became the most visited memorial in Washington, not because it was the most impressive, but because it was the most honest. It did not tell you how to feel. It did not ask you to be proud or to be ashamed. It simply gave you the names and let you stand in front of them and feel whatever you were going to feel. That honesty was what Vietnam veterans had been waiting for since they came home. Not a parade, not a speech, just someone acknowledging that these names had been real people, that what had happened to them had mattered, that the country had not forgotten, even if for a while it had tried to. The war that never fully ended. Today, Vietnam is a country, not a war. The streets of Ho Chi Minh City are full of traffic and commerce and young people who were born after the last American left. American veterans travel there and find a country that does not hate them the way the history might suggest it should. They find people who want to move forward, who have built lives on ground that was once unlivable, who have a remarkable capacity for continuing. But in America, Vietnam did not become history the way other wars did. It became something that lives inside the culture, in the way Americans think about military intervention, in the way they think about whether to trust their government, in the way they think about what they owe the people they send to fight. The word Vietnam itself became shorthand for a particular kind of American failure, not military failure, something deeper, a failure of honesty, of the belief that a democracy owes its people the truth about what it is doing in their name. The soldiers who fought in Vietnam did not fail America. America failed them. It failed them when it sent them without a clear purpose. It failed them when it kept telling them they were winning when they were not. It failed them when it brought them home and looked away. And it fails them still every time their suffering is reduced to a political argument about a war that ended 50 years ago. The real lesson of Vietnam is not about strategy. It is not about communism or dominoes or the credibility of American power. It is about what a country owes the people it asks to carry its wars, and about what happens when the answer to that question is not enough. There is a photograph taken by a journalist named Nick Utt on June 8, 1972. A 9-year-old girl running down a road after a napalm attack. Her clothes burned off, her arms outstretched, her face carrying an expression that no child should ever have to carry. Her name is Phan Thi Kim Phuc. She survived. She is alive today. She became a goodwill ambassador for UNESCO. She speaks about forgiveness, about how she chose not to let the photograph define her entire life, about how she chose to believe that the future did not have to be determined by the worst moment of the past. Her survival is remarkable. Her forgiveness is remarkable, but the photograph still exists, and it still asks the question it has always asked. What were we doing there? What did we think we were protecting? And what does it mean that a 9-year-old girl running down a road in pain became the image that finally made enough people stop and ask those questions out loud? Vietnam did not end when the last helicopter left Saigon. It ended and keeps ending every time an American veteran touches a name on a black wall in Washington and remembers a face that matches it. Every time a family puts flowers at a grave that came home from a war that still does not have a simple explanation. Every time a country tries to decide whether to send its young people somewhere far away and has to ask itself whether this time it has actually learned anything. The war is over. The questions are not. They follow America the way Vietnam followed the soldiers home, quietly, persistently, and with a patience that outlasts any administration, any election, any attempt to close the book and call it history. Some things do not become the past just because enough time has passed. Some things stay present. In the silence between a veteran and the family that loves him but cannot reach him. In the name on the wall that no one comes to visit anymore, because everyone who knew that person is also gone now. In the photograph of a little girl on a road in 1972 that is still, more than 50 years later, impossible to look at without feeling that something was owed and never paid. That is what Vietnam left behind. Not victory, not defeat, just a debt to the truth, a debt to the young, a debt to every person who was asked to carry something too heavy and was never properly helped to set it down. America has been trying to pay that debt ever since. It is still trying. And perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said about Vietnam. Not that it was right or wrong, not that it was won or lost, but that it was a mirror. And what America saw in that mirror was difficult enough that it has spent 50 years deciding how long to look. The helicopters are gone. The jungle has grown back. The names are on the wall, and the questions are still here, waiting for an answer that is worthy of the people who paid the price of asking them.